Our story begins on the distant continent of Gaia. Several years ago, monsters began to disappear from this continent in unknown ways. After much investigation, it was discovered that the monsters had been transported to other dimensions. Many wizards have delved into the study of this phenomenon. One of them managed to make significant progress in this. Magnus created a magic circle and raised his hands to the ceiling. After that, he loudly recited the movement spell. The energy emanating from the circle began to rapidly increase in strength. Suddenly, the wizard's body, enveloped in radiance, began to rise upward. The next moment, the entire room was engulfed in a blinding flash of light. The power of the spell was so strong that it covered tens of kilometers around. Magnus stood with his eyes closed, waiting for the moment when he would be transported. Feeling the air flow and temperature around him change, he opened his eyes. At first, Magnus didn't understand where he was, so he took a careful look at the area to his right. Then he turned the other way. Realizing that his efforts had not been in vain, he laughed heartily. Meanwhile, a mystical port appeared in Ethan's house. His appearance caused great surprise and confusion in the guy. Just a day ago, his life was going on as usual. Standing with a bottle of water, he looked at the happy students. He envied their carefree lifestyle because for him, such a life was a luxury. The partner walking ahead called out to Ethan, urging him to hurry. An hour later, they finished their work and returned to the car. Once inside the salon, the hero sighed wearily. When his partner excitedly asked him if he was cold in such weather, he replied that hunters were not afraid of such things. Nate was an ordinary person, so everything related to hunters surprised him. Noticing his reaction, Ethan smiled and said that thanks to this, his heating bills were much lower. When Nate asked why he, as a hunter, was working here, Ethan replied that he needed the money. The hero explained that the situation in the guild was currently too difficult. Nate immediately remembered the rumors about a psychopath who was pursuing the idea of capturing hunters from major guilds. He sighed and said that this world was going crazy. They were distracted from their conversation by a strange, loud sound that came from somewhere nearby. When Nate heard the sound of the door opening, he stared at Ethan in confusion. He ran out of the car without saying anything. It seemed to him that he heard screams. He didn't have time to run far when he saw a crowd of people rushing towards him. A whole horde of monsters was rushing after them. Ethan smiled and rubbed his palms together, thinking this was his chance to show off. He immediately turned to the system, calling up the inventory. Having chosen a weapon for himself, the hero put his palm out in front of himself. A moment later, a bat appeared in his hand. Nate walked up to him, and with a smile on his face said that he could help him. Ethan replied that normal people were not capable of harming monsters, so it was better for him to stay away from them. Nate looked at him uncertainly and asked Ethan to be careful in that case. Then he turned around and ran back. Our hero rushed towards the monsters, hoping to deal with them before the guys from the big guild arrived. He was sure that even if he caught a few small monsters, he would not have to worry about money for a long time. Suddenly, a stranger appeared next to him. Having overtaken him, the man stopped and turned sharply. Then he grabbed Ethan's shirt tightly. The hero didn't have time to understand anything before he was already flying back. He fell onto the asphalt, hitting his back painfully. Ethan didn't expect these people to come here so quickly. Titan was one of the guilds in charge of this zone. Folding his arms across his chest, Jay said dryly that Ethan shouldn't interfere where it didn't belong. He stood up and replied with displeasure that he was the first one to come here. The man chuckled and said that this area was entirely their responsibility. Ethan replied that this was not officially recorded anywhere, but only in words. Then he took off and rushed towards Jay. It was not difficult for Tom to dodge his bat. In response, he gave Ethan a stinging slap. He immediately fell back to the ground, flying slightly to the side. Jay said with a threatening tone that the hero should not cross his path. Ethan looked at his opponent carefully, rubbing his cheek. With his other hand, he gripped his bat tighter. Ethan understood that Jay was far superior to him and he was powerless here. After that, he went to another part-time job until the night. But all day until he came home, he thought about today's incident and his own weakness. Depressed by such thoughts, Ethan wearily sank down onto the sofa. Closing his eyes, he threw his head back and tried to relax. But his thoughts kept returning to the Hunters Guild. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a strange sound coming from the side. Seeing the huge portal, he slowly stood up from the sofa. When it seemed to him that there was something on the other side, he approached. His eyes widened in shock. A real goblin was looking at him from behind a thin curtain. Ethan was overcome with sheer terror and recoiled from the portal, falling to the floor. The hero began to look around, thinking that he needed a weapon. However, when he saw that the goblin simply walked past, he was shocked again. The realization occurred to him that the monsters couldn't see him. Having made sure that there was no danger, he approached the portal again. Overcoming his fear, the guy carefully put his hand into it. Ethan raised his head and looked carefully at the portal, checking for any changes in it. Afterwards, he also carefully stuck out his hand. He was pleased with the fact that there were no side effects or resistance from the portal. The thought that there was a dungeon in his apartment brought a smile to his face. Ethan took a bottle of beer from the refrigerator and immediately opened it. After taking a few sips, he slammed it down on the table in front of him. His joy quickly faded as he realized the seriousness of the situation. The hero understood that now in his apartment there was a dungeon that existed only as a concept. He sighed heavily, not knowing whether to report this to the association. He was very reluctant to do this because he was afraid of the consequences. The association would have started an investigation right there and then, and he would have been kicked out of his own apartment. Ethan reached for his beer and took another sip. Ultimately, the hero decided to keep the dungeon for himself and say nothing. Afterwards, he glanced sideways towards the portal when he realized that the monsters weren't coming through here. Deciding to test his theory, he armed himself and stood in front of the portal. Ethan was confident that his strength would be enough to catch 2 or 3 goblins. Hoping that no more goblins would come here, he entered. The surroundings changed and a system message appeared in front of him. The hero heard some sound and immediately turned around to look at it. A green goblin was rushing towards him with an axe raised to strike. Ethan reacted quickly and jumped towards the portal. A look of surprise appeared on the goblin's face as the boy suddenly disappeared into the wall. The hero saw a goblin on the other side who didn't understand anything and hoped that he would be able to enter after him. Suddenly, the goblin began to strike at empty space. This was enough to make Ethan sure that the enemies would not get here. Having resolved all his fears, he boldly rushed at the goblin. He froze in shock when Ethan appeared in front of him again. The bat flew straight into the goblin's face. He dropped the axe and flew to the side. The hero did not stop there and again jumped towards the lying enemy. With one sharp movement, he pierced the goblin's chest with his bat. Ethan stood up slowly, removing the bat from the goblin's body. This blow did not kill him, and now there was a silent plea in his eyes. Ethan raised his bat for another strike and said he better not look at him like that. He then delivered the final blow to the head, finishing off the goblin. It was the first monster Ethan had killed himself in the 3 years since he became a hunter. The hero once again realized how much the guild limits hunters. He sat down next to the goblin and thought he could sell him. After examining the body, Ethan estimated that he would receive at least 3 million won. This thought brought a smile to his face. The next day he came to one of the exchange offices. There weren't too many people, so his turn came quickly. The employee who greeted him asked what Ethan wanted to sell. The hero replied that it was a goblin and called up his inventory. A moment later, the goblin's body fell onto the table. Paul pulled on his gloves and asked for a couple of minutes to examine him. Immediately after that, he got down to business. When Paul said that Ethan had little experience as a hunter, he was surprised. The man explained that one should only aim at vital points, otherwise the price for the body would drop. Afterwards, he abandoned the body and said that he would only give 3 million won. The hero was satisfied with this price and he agreed. Suddenly, Paul asked where Ethan caught this monster. He asked why he needed this information. To this, the man replied that this was merely an established procedure. Ethan didn't know what to say. Suddenly, someone's loud screams caught his attention. 3 strangers appeared at the entrance to the floor. They walked inside and one of them pointed at Ethan and said it was him. Realizing what was happening, Paul rubbed his neck tiredly and took a deep breath. When they stopped near him, Ethan asked what they wanted. In response to this, one of the men grabbed him by the bike and said that he had stolen a monster from their area. Paul shook his head and said that this was not the one they were looking for. Then he pointed to the blonde man sitting at the other end of the room. The stranger immediately headed towards him. An unsuspecting Kevin was punched hard in the face. The blow sent him falling back in his chair. Pavel, who had been sitting with him earlier, asked the stranger what he was doing. After dragging Kevin to the floor, another man from the trio began to beat him. A few moments later, Duke ordered a stop. Then he sank down next to Kevin, who was shaking in pain. The man asked why he was wandering around someone else's territory. He raised himself and wiped away the blood, asking what they were talking about. Duke grinned and grabbed the guy by the hair. When he said that if Kevin ever went there again, he wouldn't leave alive, he just sent him away. Afterwards, under many gazes, the 3 of them, together with Kevin, headed towards the exit. Paul said that Duke should just take the money and leave the guy alone. He pointed at Kevin and replied that if he didn't want to end up the same way, it was better not to interfere. When they left, Ethan asked how Paul knew these guys. He replied that all the guilds were connected to their server. Afterwards, the hero asked if Kevin really confessed to the theft. The man explained that if he was caught lying about the location, his hunting license would be confiscated. Ethan pursed his lips in displeasure, having narrowly escaped trouble. Afterwards, he apologized and called up his inventory again. The goblin disappeared from the table and returned back. Ethan turned around and said he had changed his mind about selling it. He had no desire to get into trouble, so he decided to think about his actions. Our hero returned home closer to evening. He decided that he would enter the dungeon again and began preparations. In front of him now was the return stone he had acquired. He also bought another useful thing. The search radar is capable of detecting nearby monsters. Although its range was small, it was enough for the hero. He smiled as the radar picked up his first target. After closing it, Ethan decided it was time to go hunting. Using the bat, he managed to get rid of the first goblin without any difficulty. Then with the second one. As he killed goblins, his level slowly increased. When the hero was exhausted, he decided to take a short break. He was curious how far his progress had gone. Opening the characteristics window, Ethan sighed in disappointment. He expected more. Rising to his feet, he decided it was time to resume his hunt. But before that, he called up his inventory and placed 2 goblins there. Their number there has already reached 19, so a message appeared in front of Ethan saying that there was only one free spot left. The hero turned his gaze to the radar, deciding that he should find a stronger target. A yellow dot immediately appeared there. She was heading straight for Ethan. The hero hid around the corner, deciding to wait and attack suddenly. He assumed an attack stance and began to listen. As the footsteps got closer, he gripped the bat tighter. A moment later, the monster's helmet appeared from around the corner. Ethan reacted instantly and attacked. His attack instantly knocked the helmet off. The hero watched this with bewilderment. Then he turned his gaze to the monster clutching his head. He didn't look like a goblin at all, but like an ordinary person. Leaning forward a little, Ethan asked if the old man was okay. He pointed his finger at him and burst into curses. The hero tried to understand at least a word, but this language was unfamiliar to him. He thought the best way out was to bow and apologize. The old man's face reflected surprise, and he even stopped swearing. He reached into his bag and started looking for something there. A few moments later, he threw the amulet to the hero. He grabbed it and asked what it was. The old man gestured that it should be put on the neck. Ethan repeated his movements and hesitantly put on the amulet. Once on him, the amulet began to shine brightly. After this, the old man began to scream loudly again. Now Ethan understood him and explained that there had been a misunderstanding, but this did not quell the old man's anger. The boy bowed to him again and apologized. Austin said that this was the first time he had seen anyone like this in his entire dwarven life. Ethan was very surprised to hear that the old man was a dwarf. He started picking up everything Austin had dropped from the floor while he was putting his helmet back on. Raising another blade, the hero found it hard to believe that all of this belonged to the dwarf. Suddenly, a message appeared in front of him that he had a rare item in his hands. Austin shouted for Ethan to give him back those daggers immediately. The hero thought with regret that he too would like to have a strong weapon. With these thoughts, he approached the dwarf holding the bag. He put everything he had found into it, but Austin's attention was drawn to something else. Ethan patted the bag and said it was ready. Looking up, he asked the dwarf what he was doing, but he didn't answer, his gaze wandering over his bat. Afterwards, Austin looked at him and asked where Ethan got it. The guy's face showed confusion. The dwarf noticed this and explained that this weapon was made of a rare mountain metal. Ethan didn't understand it. On Earth, it was the most accessible and widespread metal. But as it turned out later, in this world it is a very rare and valuable metal. Austin also invited Ethan to his workshop where the hero was now. He carefully examined all the weapons created by the dwarf. He didn't understand why the dwarf lived in this dungeon alone. Suddenly, he was interrupted from his thoughts by loud knocks in the next room. Ethan decided to ignore it and return to his thoughts. He felt a strange excitement. A few minutes later, the door finally opened. Austin came out and said it had improved his bat. Then he threw her to Ethan. He deftly caught it with one hand. Looking closely at the reddened metal, he asked if it was really his bat. Austin explained that this is a characteristic of the rock metal. The more you enchant this metal, the redder and stronger it becomes. Ethan's eyes widened in shock upon hearing about the enchantment. He immediately decided to test his updated weapon. The bat became much heavier but no less deadly. The hero knew that such a weapon was very rare and valuable. After trying it out, he found it hard to believe that it was really his bat. Ethan realized that Austin was far from a simple gnome. He didn't even expect that this dungeon would be so useful. When the hero studied the bat's characteristics, he saw that its durability had increased to S level. He would have gladly sold it, but he couldn't do it. Earlier, Ethan asked Austin if he could take her. He replied that he didn't have to worry because no one else could use it except Ethan. Having called up the inventory, the hero moved his weapon there. It immediately began to disappear from his palm. Afterwards, he clicked on the next section of the inventory. He already had 20 killed goblins. He decided to sell them and make money. Ethan wondered where he could safely sell them. At that moment, he remembered the existence of the black market. The very next day, he got the contacts and went to the meeting. Finding himself at a deserted construction site, Ethan slowed his pace. According to the information provided, he should have already been there. The hero glanced again at the business card, which did not inspire confidence. Suddenly, a stranger's voice called out to him from above. Peter pointed behind him and told Ethan to go upstairs. Having gone up one floor, he met with his client. Alan asked if they could look at the goblins first. The hero nodded and called up the inventory. Then he clicked on the goblin icon. All 20 bodies immediately materialized in front of the men. Alan and Pavel examined them all carefully, noting the good condition of the bodies. A little later, Alan said that he confirmed the goods. In response, the hero said that he was ready to sell them all. When Alan asked how much he wanted for them, Ethan said 5 million ahead. The man grinned and said he was willing to give 3 million for each. Here, Paul intervened, saying that for such quality, this was too little. Alan already regretted bringing him along. After clearing his throat, he said that the maximum was 3.5 million. Ethan replied that the minimum cost was 4.5. Noticing Alan's doubt, he said that in that case, he would find another buyer. Suddenly, security guards ran up to the floor and announced that there was a monster here. This greatly surprised everyone sitting here. Ethan remembered that monster corpses attract other monsters. Looking at one of the guards, he asked where this monster was now. Hearing that there were 2 orcs below, Ethan frowned. Calling up his inventory, he placed the goblin bodies back. When he wanted to run, he realized that it was too late. The next moment, one of the orcs appeared right in front of him. He looked incredibly dangerous and strong. Alex shouted that Ethan had to do something because he was a hunter. The orc left him no choice, rushing at him with a terrifying roar. When the orc swung his axe, the hero realized that he would not be able to dodge. Suddenly, the inventory opened and a bat flew out. She blocked the monster's attack. The orc applied more force, but only began to slide backwards. Thus, he found himself a couple of meters away from our hero. Alan and Peter were amazed by what they saw. The hero himself was surprised that the bat blocked the attack on its own. Remembering the spells placed on the weapon, Ethan smiled. The orc did not let him rejoice for long and rushed at him again. He grabbed the bat with both hands. Then he took a step to the side and struck the monster in the knee. The orc growled in pain. The next blow landed on the head. Ethan swung for another blow at his stunned enemy, but he fell down dead before he could do anything. There was a smile on the hero's face. He liked the updated bat incredibly. The message that appeared said that he had increased his level to 36. Alec called out to him and pointed behind him excitedly. A second orc attacked him from behind, but the hero deftly dodged. Now he had more self-confidence and was not afraid of the orc. Finding himself on the side, he dealt the monster a noticeable blow to the back. He immediately dropped to his knees, opening up to Ethan. Our hero took advantage of this and delivered the final attack. The orc's body trembled slightly and the veins on his head swelled. The next moment he lost consciousness and fell down. The men present witnessed Ethan defeat 2 orcs. The guy sighed with relief and looked at his bat. When Peter asked what they should do, Alec told him to shut up. At that moment, Ethan looked at him and suggested that they negotiate again. He returned home again only in the evening. He managed to get a good amount of money by selling all those bodies. Putting the phone down, he sighed with relief and the hero breathed a sigh of relief. He was pleased with the thought that he had found a great way to make money. Alec decided to continue doing business with Ethan. So now he was faced with the task of becoming stronger. He jumped out of bed when an idea came to his mind. If everything goes well, he will be able to receive items for free. A little later, armed with a box of alcohol, he dropped in on Austin. The gnome looked at the beer can made of aluminum with surprise. Ethan smiled and said there was alcohol inside. Austin asked if such a rare metal was really used as a drinking vessel. When he tasted the contents, he immediately spat it on the floor. He was unhappy that they dared to call such a nasty thing beer. Opening a bottle of soju, Ethan decided that something stronger would appeal to the dwarf. Then he handed the can to him, saying that this alcohol would be better. Austin looked at him uncertainly and replied that he would only take 1 sip. Our hero's assumption was confirmed. The gnome spoke highly of the drink. Afterwards, he turned his gaze to Ethan and said that there was one thing for him to do. The guy was surprised and asked what he needed to do. A little later, Ethan went in search of mithril, a mystical metal. Taking a deep breath, the hero thought that he was doing this only for the sake of his weapon. Thus he continued on his way. Sometime later, he came out of the dungeon and found himself in the forest. The system asked him to set the current position at the warp point. Ethan didn't know what it was and decided to agree. At that moment, a portal opened in front of him. The system explained that here he could move from the first to the second floor. The hero decided that he had made the right choice and would take advantage of it on the way back. Afterwards, he went further into the labyrinth of skulls and wolves. His first opponent was a huge wolf that jumped out of nowhere. Using a bat, Ethan dealt with her in 1 blow. She flew off to the side, dead. For his death, the hero was able to gain only 1 level. The next moment, a whole pack of wolves was rushing towards the hero. Looking at them, the hero realized that he would gain a lot of experience. With a smile on his face, he rushed towards them. Without any effort, he killed the wolves one after another. The wolves came at him in a never-ending stream, but Ethan did not slow down. Half an hour later, the entire flock was defeated. The hero managed to reach level 74 and obtain 25 bodies. Estimating the price for 1 body, Ethan was confident that he would receive more than 200 million. A smile blossomed on his face at the thought of such a sum. However, as soon as he remembered Austin, the joy disappeared. Remembering his mission, he headed deeper into the ruins. The hero walked for quite a long time and suddenly heard a noise nearby. Turning around, he saw a huge crowd of burning skeletons. They were all moving straight towards him. Ethan looked at them in confusion. He was very unhappy because he knew he wouldn't make much money from them. The hero easily cut off the head of the first skeleton. However, even after losing his head, he did not die. A moment later, he began to attack Ethan even more furiously. Our hero didn't expect this from skeletons. Suddenly, he noticed a silver core on his chest that needed to be destroyed. He swung and attacked his opponent's weak spot. Immediately after that, another skeleton jumped on him. Ethan miraculously dodged. While he was fighting him off, the rest of the crowd also arrived to join them. The hero understood that he had to push harder if he didn't want to die here. Then he swung the bat and got rid of another skeleton. In this way, he destroyed them one by one, attacking the core. Sometime later, all the skeletons were destroyed. Ethan breathed a sigh of relief, deciding to celebrate the day with a drink. The system informed him that he had reached level 100 and that he could now change his class. The hero expected to see a warrior as his class, but instead it turned out to be a priest. Using the portal, Ethan returned back to Austin. The gnome examined the guy carefully, noting that he was completely fine. He later admitted that he expected Ethan to return with serious wounds, but he turned out to be unharmed. To this, the guy replied that he was barely alive now and not at all okay. Austin just laughed and looked inside the bag. When he asked if that was all the mithril there was, Ethan looked away and said that it was all. The gnome sighed and said that he could now make weapons and asked if Ethan needed any special function. He thoughtfully replied that something invisible was needed for defense. Austin smiled and said it would be a piece of cake. Upon returning, the hero immediately went to bed, setting the alarm clock. The guy opened his eyes with difficulty and reached for his phone to turn off the alarm. Then he sat up and stretched on the bed. It was too hot in the gnome's workshop, so he decided to while away the time by sleeping. By this time, Austin had already finished everything. He tiredly wiped the sweat from his face, looking at the armor he had created. Hearing footsteps, the gnome turned towards the entrance. Keeping his eyes on Ethan, he asked where he had been, to which he replied that he had just been out for a bit. When he noticed the armor, he immediately approached the table. He took it in his hands and examined it carefully. As soon as he put on the armor, Austin hit him in the chest with his hammer. The blow sent Ethan flying several meters to the side. Austin kept his eyes on him and asked how he liked the armor. The hero felt himself in surprise and replied that he didn't feel any pain anywhere. He picked up the bike and ran his hand over the metal, amazed at its strength. Approaching Austin, he bowed and thanked him for it. He turned away, hiding the smile on his lips, and said that he didn't need gratitude. Afterwards, he took one of the barrels and gave it to the guy. Ethan looked at her in surprise and asked what it was. Austin smiled and replied that he would know when he tried it. Immediately after this, our hero returned home. The barrel he received contained incredibly tasty alcohol. Ethan wondered how soju got its flavor. Austin once mentioned that if you pour alcohol into a mithril barrel, the taste will improve. The memory of this gave birth to a brilliant idea in his head. He contacted Alan and said he had something for sale. The man's eyes lit up with interest when he heard this. However, when he learned that the goods were kobold bodies and alcohol, his face showed confusion. The next morning, the Titans conducted a recruit screening at the training area. A man suddenly came running and reported a serious problem. He pointed towards the portal from which a new batch of monsters was emerging. Call noticed that their numbers had increased significantly. Joe asked what they should do since they couldn't handle all of them. Call frowned, not wanting to leave this matter in someone else's hands. So for the sake of the guild's prestige, he ordered everyone to prepare for an attack. He shouted that if anyone dared to escape, he would kill them himself. Meanwhile, Ethan officially upgraded his class. Once everything was ready, he received his new ID. The hero was glad. He knew that guilds often hired healers because they were very rare. Suddenly, an out-of-breath man blocked his way at the door. Breathing heavily, he asked if there was a free healer. Ethan raised his hand, saying that he was a healer. Afterwards, he clarified that he only had a C rank, but that was enough for the man, and he asked him to follow him. Meanwhile, a fierce battle was taking place in the training area. The guild members were failing, and the monsters were increasingly pressing them. Will ran to his wounded comrade to help him up. At that moment, a monster rushed at them from above. Another hunter arrived in time and got rid of the monster. By this time, the men had already managed to rise from the ground. Nate turned to them and shouted that they needed to get their act together and fight normally. Then he rushed at the next monster. Call observed the situation and was very unhappy with the weakness of the newcomers. Screaming in irritation, he rushed at the enemies, intending to kill each one. The other hunters watched his actions in surprise. Just at that moment, Ethan arrived here and was put in charge of the doctors. After explaining what to do, the man ran off to fight the monsters. With a sigh, the hero activated his healing abilities. The healing energy immediately reached out to the body of one of the hunters. Thanks to a new surge of strength, he managed to inflict damage on the monster. At that very moment, another hunter was wounded. Ethan turned to his colleague and said that there would be no end to this, and it would be better to turn to another guild. He just nodded and returned to work, and the hero pursed his lips in displeasure. Suddenly, his eyes widened in surprise. The monster was about to attack him from behind, but the bat itself blocked the blow again. Ethan quickly turned around and grabbed the bat. The monster flew back. The other healers immediately panicked at the sight of these monsters. Ethan told them not to worry and to focus on healing. His words left them puzzled. Ethan pointed towards the struggling hunters and said that now was not the time to relax. Afterwards, he ran towards the monster, shouting that he could handle it. At first, the hero was very nervous when entering into battle with monsters. But when I realized that they weren't that strong, I relaxed. Although his opponent was agile, he was not far behind. He used the bat to break the head of the enemy he had knocked down. Suddenly, one of the monsters rushed towards the healers. Ethan ran after him. He jumped into the air and raised the bat to strike. The monster didn't notice him and missed this attack. Immediately after this, the hero jumped back to the ground. At that very moment, he was attacked. Ethan looked behind him and saw that the monster's sword had pierced his bike. He swung the bat and hit the monster in the face. He immediately flew back. Greg was shocked by his abilities. The other doctors were grateful to him because they could focus on healing. Suddenly, fear appeared on the monsters' faces. Bishop, who had just arrived at the scene of the battle, cut down the monster with one movement. This man was the leader of the Titans Guild. After getting rid of the rest of the monsters, he asked Ethan if he had killed the rest. He replied that yes. The doctors' faces stretched in surprise when they saw Bishop. When Ethan asked who it was, he was told it was the guild leader. Greg sighed and said with relief that he could now go home. Meanwhile, Bishop had already jumped up from his seat. Once he was near Ethan, he said that they would make it up to him later. After this, the hunter rushed on. The hero only needed one look at this man to understand that he was incredible. He found himself in the epicenter of the battle in the shortest possible time. Turning to his hunters, he said that they had all done a good job. Noticing his appearance, everyone was delighted. Call just clicked his tongue in displeasure. Bishop shouted for everyone who was exhausted to step back. Now he would lead the capture. He then assumed an attacking stance and moved his fist behind his back to strike. All the hunters immediately rushed back at the sight of this. Suddenly, Bishop screamed loudly. The next moment, he punched the ground. All the monsters were destroyed in that instant. All the hunters watched this with enthusiasm. Ethan was also surprised that all the monsters were destroyed at once in one blow. A few moments later, everything stopped and only corpses lay on the ground. Bishop said that the hunt was over and now they needed to collect the bodies. Then he called out to Call. Grabbing him by the scruff of the neck, he asked what Call was even thinking, trying to kill everyone. He replied that he could have ruined the guild's reputation if he had acted differently. Bishop frowned and said that Call only thought about himself. He replied that this was not so. Suddenly, their quarrel was interrupted by a hunter who approached. Pointing behind him, he said that the healers who were helping needed to be sent back. Bishop nodded and said that he and Call would continue later. Afterwards, he apologized to the healers and thanked them for their help. He expressed special gratitude to Ethan, praising his skills. When he asked his name, the hero introduced himself. Afterwards, Bishop offered the hero to join their guild, without paying a fee for joining. Hearing this, Call became furious. He said that Ethan was too weak, and they couldn't allow it. When Bishop called his name, he fell silent. The guild leader let out a shout, saying that Ethan was the one who saved their guild's reputation. The other hunters watched this in surprise. A barely noticeable smile appeared on the hero's face. Call was as gray as a thundercloud when he was ordered to apologize to Ethan. At this point, Ethan said that he was refusing the offer. He couldn't trust such a vice leader. Hearing this, he immediately rushed at him. He swung his hand to attack, gathering energy in his palm. At that moment, a bat flew out of the inventory. She punched Call in the stomach, knocking him down. The next day, news of his defeat was already online. The co-founders came to the bishop, demanding that he bring Ethan so that he could refute everything. Oliver said their reputation would suffer if Bishop did nothing. He put the cup on the table and said that it was not Ethan's fault, but Call's. He blamed him for the fact that almost all of their recruits died. So he decided to strip Call of his title as Vice Guild leader. With this, he closed today's question. After this, Bishop dismissed everyone gathered there. Ethan interested him greatly, so he wanted to win him over to his side. Meanwhile, the hero was at home, thoughtfully looking at his phone. He was upset that he had earned money and spent too much. He sighed and threw the phone on the table. Then he reached for the beer and took a few sips. Ethan decided to focus on his main source of income. Using the portal, he was poisoned into the dungeon. Now the ordinary monsters he caught before weren't enough for him. So he decided to hunt for something more powerful. An hour later, he climbed into the deepest part of the dungeon. Suddenly, he heard approaching footsteps. Ethan turned around, hoping it would be a monster. His hopes were justified, and an orc attacked him. He swung his axe and attacked. Ethan dodged and counterpunched him in the chest. The orc immediately flew to the side. This blow was enough to kill the orc. By this time, a whole horde of other orcs had arrived here. Ethan smiled and gestured for them to attack. They immediately rushed at him, shouting loudly. The hero ran towards them, smiling broadly. It didn't take him long, and now he had 20 monsters in his inventory. Having hidden it, he headed deeper into the dungeon. The building he descended into reminded him of an old temple. Sometime later, he reached the 3rd level, the labyrinth of the temple defender. Ethan looked around for monsters, which weren't there. Suddenly, he heard a strange cracking sound below. The next moment, a huge hand burst out from under the floor. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise at the sight. A huge stone monster was now chasing him. The hero didn't expect this monster to be so fast. He miraculously managed to block the attack. When the monster removed its paw, the hero flew back a little. Ethan decided that he had to be careful if he didn't want to die. Suddenly, he noticed something that surprised him. The monster's entire body was made entirely of stone. The hero heard about such monsters, created artificially. When he attacked again, Ethan easily dodged. He assumed that this golem's intelligence was not high. Therefore, it was enough for him to approach from behind and attack. The golem shattered into pieces and Ethan landed on the floor. Having dealt with him, the hero sighed with relief. A smile played on his face from the fact that he could now deal with even a golem. Suddenly, the monster's shattered body began to come back together. Ethan became wary as he watched this. A few moments later, the golem's eyes began to glow with anger again. Rising to his feet, the golem raised his fist to strike. Only then did Ethan remember that he needed to destroy the core. Looking at the monster, he decided that now was the time to retreat. However, before he could take a single step, a stone hand wrapped around his leg. Ethan looked down in confusion. At that moment, someone fired an arrow. She flew straight into the chest of the first golem. It fell apart in a bright flash. Despite this, the second golem still continued to hold him. But the hero now knew where to aim, so he attacked the golem with the bat at its chest. Looking at the wreckage, Ethan sighed and said that it was dangerous. He understood perfectly well that if it weren't for that arrow, he would already be dead. Remembering this, he turned towards the entrance to find out who had helped him. The hero expected it to be Austin, but through the dust he saw a completely different figure. A beautiful blonde girl came out to him. Looking closely, he noticed her elven ears. Ethan bowed his head and thanked her for her help. Then he looked up at her. The girl approached him and grabbed him by the collar of his jacket. Pulling him towards herself, she asked where he was from and how long he had been imprisoned here. Ethan didn't understand what she was talking about and said that he had just come here today. The girl's face showed surprise and disbelief. Afterwards, she looked around and asked if there was an entrance to this dungeon. Ethan nodded in response. Delighted, Eliza let the guy go, pushing him back. He fell to the floor with a bang. Ethan stood up and asked her with displeasure what she was doing. She demanded that he take her to the exit through which he had come here. The hero considered her request for a few moments. Noticing this, Eliza said that she would give him a reward, and that she was a mercenary of the Golden Wound. Afterwards, she introduced herself and said that everyone had heard of her name, but Ethan admitted that this was the first time he had heard of her. Then the girl showed him the mercenary's badge. The hero looked at him carefully. When Eliza asked if he recognized him, Ethan replied that he did not. The elf sighed and asked what wilderness he came from. He answered thoughtfully that he was from Seoul and had never heard of elves living in Korea. Eliza frowned. It was the first time she had heard these names. Afterwards, she asked if this was Ethan's first time here today, and he replied that he had been here several times already. The elf assumed that the magician was able to use movement between worlds. Ethan was surprised by the news after hearing this. Sighing, the girl said that now she needed to start looking for a way back. The hero thought that it would be very disadvantageous for him if the dungeon disappeared. He asked if Eliza really wanted to send the dungeon back. She replied that she couldn't do it now. Afterwards, she told Ethan that there was a secret room here. Approaching the guy, Eliza asked him for help to get there. In return, she promised to tell something and give the boss's reward. These terms were favorable to Ethan, and he agreed. On the way, they met several more orcs, but the heroes dealt with them well. Ethan killed one after another with a bat, with a smile on his face, and Eliza pierced their heads with a sword. A few minutes later, all the orcs fell. Eliza looked at Ethan and said that he was stronger than he looked. He grinned and replied that it was nothing to him. After that, they moved on to look for a room. Suddenly, a loud rumbling sound came from the hero's stomach. He suggested taking a break and resting a bit. Eliza agreed with him. Ethan took the candy bar out of his inventory and immediately opened it. The girl limited herself to just a bottle of water. The hero noticed this, so I handed her the bar and suggested she try it. She was in no hurry to take it and said that they could drop the formalities. Ethan replied that he couldn't do that to someone much older than him. Eliza immediately drew her bow, pointing it at the boy. Afterwards, she said that by elf standards, she was still very young. The hero raised his palms, apologizing for his rudeness. Eliza removed the onion, adding that she doesn't eat everything. A few minutes later, there were a lot of empty candy wrappers lying on the floor. The elf was actively chewing one candy bar after another, and when they ran out, she asked Ethan for more. He shrugged and replied that there were none anymore. Eliza sighed in disappointment and rose to her feet. Afterwards, she said that they should move on. Ethan just sighed, having to give up all his supplies. Sometime later, they stopped at a massive door. Ethan asked what exactly she was looking for there. She replied that the mage could have left spells there. Her words made him wonder if it was in vain that he agreed to help. Suddenly, Eliza said that the boss was approaching. Afterwards, she added that she could handle it herself, but he would have to see it through to the end. A moment later, a huge armored monster appeared in front of them. Eliza stepped forward and drew her bow. Without taking her eyes off the enemy, she told Ethan to watch closely. Her subsequent actions caused the hero's eyes to widen in shock. Eliza fired 3 arrows at once. The girl, confident in her abilities, smiled. All the arrows hit the target at the same time. The monster fell to the floor with a crash. The hero was shocked by what happened. Looking at him, Eliza said that this technique was called aura. He enthusiastically asked if she would teach him this. She smiled and nodded. This technique impressed the hero greatly, so he could not miss this chance. Pointing to the monster, Eliza said that they should finish with him first. Ethan ran up to him after the girl reminded him about the core. He raised the bat over the monster's chest with a smile on his face. Then he hit with all his might. His bat easily pierced the armor, leaving a hole in the chest. Ethan realized that one blow was not enough, because the monster did not crumble. Suddenly, he noticed movement to the side. The monster's fist attacked him, but Ethan managed to put a shield in front of himself. Seeing him, surprise appeared on Eliza's face. Afterwards, the hero jumped on the enemy again. He struck him hard on the chest, but the armor wouldn't give in anymore, no matter how much he hit. In one of these blows, he put as much force as possible. There was a cracking sound under his feet. He finally managed to penetrate the armor and destroy the core. The monster immediately fell apart. He slung the bat over his shoulder and asked if Eliza would teach him aura now. To this, the girl replied that he had just used her anyway. Ethan asked in confusion if she was talking about a skill. She replied that she didn't know what it was, but he was quite talented. Hearing this, Ethan became more aware. Eliza said that the divine power he used was a modified aura. The hero asked if he could use her whenever he wanted, but the girl did not give a clear answer. When he suggested trying it now, she reminded him of the terms of the agreement. The next day, Bishop was walking down one of the streets with Maria. They discussed the news that a wave of powerful monsters would arrive in 5 days. The man sighed, saying that their guild alone couldn't handle all of this. The secretary asked what he planned to do. He suggested looking for free hunters. Suddenly he stopped. Something caught his attention. Ethan was walking along the other side of the street with a box in his hands. Having said goodbye to Maria, he headed towards him. The girl just sighed with displeasure, looking after him. Ethan looked at the box full of bars, hoping that this would be enough. Suddenly he heard someone calling him. The hero turned around and saw Bishop in front of him. He once again raised the question of his joining the guild. When Ethan refused, Bishop offered to become a mercenary and work for him. The hero promised to think about it. Hours later, he returned to the dungeon, where Eliza was actively eating candy bars. Besides the bars, there were other goodies in the box that interested her. Having emptied all the contents, she patted her stomach and said that she was full. Suddenly, Ethan asked why she was still sitting in that basement. Eliza pointed to the ceiling with a strange pattern. She explained that it was a magic circle and the dungeon was the path to Ethan's world. Therefore, she will be busy exploring the dungeon for some time, and she ordered the hero to bring more bars if he wanted to master aura. He grinned, agreeing to her manipulation. After that, Eliza took his hand. She explained that this is the fastest way to master the aura, and she advised him to remember the feeling of how streams of aura enter his body. The hero nodded uncertainly. Then he turned his gaze to their palms, shrouded in radiance. Suddenly, the glow intensified. Ethan felt something actually entering his body. Some kind of inner strength was absorbed into every vessel of his body. His eyes widened in surprise when he realized it was an aura. When it was all over, Eliza let go of his hand. She noted that Ethan really has good abilities. She was filled with confidence that he would master the basics today. The hero tried to figure out what had happened. Looking at him, Eliza asked if he would be able to remember this flow of aura. He nodded confidently. After that, she said that she was going to investigate the circle on the ceiling, and she told him to master the aura at this time. When he asked how he could do it, she replied that he had to practice. Ethan followed her advice. He had been fighting goblins and wolves for an hour now. The hero tried his best to activate his aura. After killing everyone, he immediately moved their bodies into his inventory. Eliza, who had returned, watched this from the side. Ethan asked with displeasure if that made any sense at all. She replied that he himself must learn how to activate the power. Suddenly, the floor beneath the guy's feet became covered in cracks. The hero cursed quietly, already understanding what this meant. The next moment, another golem burst to the surface. Eliza shouted that Ethan should concentrate and feel the divine power. She also reminded me about the shield that was summoned using the aura. She advised him to think about the feeling when he used it. Ethan created a shield in front of himself, blocking the monster's attack. He tried to understand what he should feel now. Suddenly, he finally managed to feel something. It felt like some kind of energy had hit him from outside. But when the monster let out a scream, his concentration collapsed, as did the shield. Taking advantage of this, the monster attacked. Ethan decided he had to try again. But the next moment, something happened that he did not expect. The shape of the shield was too strange, like a soap bubble. It was not difficult for the monster to break through his defense. The hero flew into the wall, hitting his back painfully. Eliza shouted at him to focus on the sensations. Rising to his feet, he replied that he had done everything as she had said. Suddenly, he saw a message from which he learned that he had a new skill. The elf drew her bow, saying that she would help him, otherwise he risked dying. But Ethan shouted at her not to interfere. After that, he rushed into the attack. The monster slammed his fist into the floor where Ethan had just been standing. The hero himself turned over in the air, avoiding the enemy's blow. Then he struck, putting all his mana into the bat. The golem couldn't stand it and fell to the floor. Ethan landed on top of him, deciding to add more concentration. Focusing on his goal, he shouted loudly. Then he dealt a crushing blow to the monster's chest. Eliza was surprised that Ethan had mastered the aura so quickly. The golem's body immediately began to crack. A moment later, it broke into many pieces. The hero looked at the system messages and was glad that everything worked out for him. Afterwards, he sat down tiredly on one of the stones. Eliza came down and praised him. Ethan said he had figured out how it worked. The girl silently studied him with her eyes. She was going to tell him in a few words and leave it at that. But everything didn't go according to her plan, and now our hero has acquired another skill. Sighing, the girl took the arrow, saying that the break was over. She then pointed the bow at him, causing Ethan to become frightened. She explained that they needed to move on. The next moment, Eliza shot an arrow. She flew towards the entrance and caused an explosion there. Through the smoke, Ethan saw several figures of monsters. Looking closely, he recognized them as orcs. The hero sighed, saying that elves are worse than any demons. He clutched his bat in irritation. He had no choice but to fight to become stronger. Immediately after the dungeon, the hero headed towards Alan. When he asked what happened to Ethan, he put the can of cola on the table. Afterwards, he replied that he had simply had a hard day. Alan felt like this guy had been on a battlefield. He said he agreed to buy all the bodies Ethan brought. When the conversation turned to soju, interest sparkled in the hero's eyes. Half an hour later, he said goodbye and went outside. He carried a box of soju in his arms. He was pleased that the alcohol he brought had become very popular. With such joyful thoughts, he headed home. Once home, he immediately fell onto the bed. Ethan felt like he would sleep for days after such a brutal workout. After talking to Eliza more, he became convinced that she was from another world. Skills alone that do not exist in this world already say a lot. In addition, instead of ability activation words, she uses mana. That's why he didn't immediately understand the point of using aura. While thinking about this, Ethan didn't notice how he fell asleep. Sometime later, he was awakened by some strange sound. Sitting up in bed, he realized that it was a signal of a natural disaster. There was real chaos on the city streets. Everyone tried to take shelter in their houses as quickly as possible. Ethan looked at his phone, checking today's date. Looking outside, he realized that today was the day the monsters appeared. The hero did not expect this day to come so quickly. He leaned back against the pillow, deciding that the guilds would sort it out themselves. Suddenly, he received a message on his phone. It said that the reward for killing monsters had increased threefold. After this news, the hero immediately became motivated. As soon as he went outside, he immediately took his bat out of his inventory. There was an anticipatory smile on his face. Usually monsters appear on random days, but there are also regular appearances. Now was one of those. An endless horde of monsters has taken over the city. The hunters did everything possible to hold them back and prevent them from going further. Suddenly, Bishop appeared on the battlefield and punched the ground. Most of the monsters were immediately killed by this attack. Bishop looked up to check the result. Call was also actively destroying monsters. Suddenly, one monster crept up from behind and attacked the hunter. But Bishop came to his aid. With one blow, he felled a huge orc. He understood that there were too many monsters and they simply couldn't cope. Maria watched everything from the side. She noticed that the guild leader was also gradually losing strength. She wished there was at least one hunter here who could help. Suddenly, she remembered someone. Meanwhile, our hero, smiling, destroyed the small goblins. Suddenly, he felt the phone in his pocket vibrate. Ethan answered Maria's call. He immediately asked if they were calling him because of the monsters. She replied that the situation was terrible and they needed help, and that she would sort out all the problems. Before Ethan could answer, Maria asked him to listen to her until the end, after which she said that they would give him the best reward on his terms. The hero dealt with the monster that attacked from behind. Afterwards, he replied that he would take a reward 5 times greater for one monster. Maria agreed and suggested meeting now to discuss the details. 20 minutes later, they met at the appointed place. Maria said that she could increase the reward by 4 times at most. The hero agreed with this. After that, the girl put something in his palm. When Ethan asked what it was, she explained that it was a monster counter. At that moment, 2 goblins attacked them from above. Maria ducked as Ethan attacked the 2 monsters in one fell swoop. They flew into the wall, hitting their heads. 2 points immediately appeared on the counter. The girl explained that points are marked there depending on the level of the monster. At present, hunters on the front lines have already earned 80 points. So if Ethan wants a big reward, he's going to have to try hard. Suddenly, the hero asked her if she knew what real healing was. When she said no, Ethan said it was to destroy the one doing the damage. Having said this, he jumped up from his seat. Maria looked at his retreating back. She hoped that he could help their guild. A few minutes later, he arrived at the front lines, where he was attacked by an orc. Ethan broke his club with one blow, surprising the monster. Afterwards, he charged the bat with mana and attacked the orc himself. The blow landed on the head. All the hunter's attention was immediately captured by Ethan. That blow was enough to make the monster fall down dead. Thanks to Eliza, Ethan was able to deal with monsters much stronger than himself. The other hunters couldn't take their puzzled looks off him. Ethan smiled, thinking that he was now stronger than an A rank. After a while, he took a break to drink a mana potion. Ethan was confident that if he maintained his mana, he would be able to kill all the monsters here. Suddenly, he noticed a monster rushing towards him. He let out a furious roar. Ethan swung the bat, imagining how much money he would make. Call was also active in getting rid of monsters. Suddenly, he noticed that their numbers had significantly decreased. Noticing the crowd, he approached the other hunters. Afterwards, he shouted that there was an active battle going on now and it was not time to relax. The hunters immediately rushed to help the others kill the monsters. Ethan didn't budge. At the sight of him, Call immediately remembered that shameful day of their last meeting. The hunter clicked his tongue in displeasure. Suddenly, a smile appeared on his lips and he rushed at Ethan. Hearing footsteps behind him, the hero turned around. It only took one swing of his hand for Call to fly back, unconscious. Ethan sighed, saying he didn't have time for psychos. The hunter's body, which had fallen to the ground, trembled slightly. Meanwhile, Bishop found himself in a difficult situation. His mana was at 0, and the opponent in front of him was of a high level. The monster growled and rushed at him. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice from above. Bishop looked up to see Ethan. He grabbed the monster by the horns and threw him to the ground. Having fallen from such a height, he immediately lost consciousness. Bishop was surprised that a hunter who had barely reached C rank had taken down a minotaur. He was convinced that his earlier intuition had not failed him, and that they needed this guy. Ethan turned to Bishop and asked if he could finish off the monster. Having received his approval, he raised the bat to strike. When it was all over, Ethan approached Bishop and explained why he was there. He extended his hand to him and once again invited him to join the guild. Ethan looked at him uncertainly, not deciding on an answer. Then he turned around and said that the work was not finished yet. Bishop looked at him with regret, realizing that it simply wouldn't happen. Suddenly they contacted him and informed him of the emergency. He looked up at the sky in surprise. Ethan looked up too. He noticed that something strange was happening with the weather. The storm clouds gathered more and more above them. Suddenly a strong lightning bolt struck the hunters. Another lightning bolt struck near Ethan and Bishop. The latter demanded details of what was happening. At that very moment, a monster appeared from the thundercloud. Bishop was told that its length was about 500 meters. The monster growled and lightning began to gather around him again. Another bolt of lightning flew at our heroes, miraculously not hitting them. When Bishop asked if Ethan could handle it, he said yes. The hero looked up again, asking what kind of monster it was. The man replied that he was seeing it for the first time and suggested heading towards the guild. It didn't take them long to get to the office. Now Bishop and Maria were watching the camera footage. The man considered what they could do. Using missiles or melee attacks was useless. Maria suggested attacking from an ambush, beyond the reach of lightning. Ethan was also thinking carefully about everything. Suddenly, he remembered Eliza and her shooting skills. Taking a step forward, drawing attention to yourself. After which he said that he had an idea on how to kill the monster. Within 2 hours, Bishop managed to call an emergency meeting. Andre asked with displeasure if he really trusted that guy so much. He didn't understand how a C-rank hunter would find any way. Nate said Bishop was capable of handling this monster on his own. He reminded that the monster destroys its target within a radius of 1 kilometer. The hunter realized the absurdity of his proposal and hastened to apologize. Maria suggested waiting for help from the Getia Guild, but Bishop said they couldn't rely on the mages. They would have destroyed the monster. But the city and its inhabitants would have suffered as well. So their last hope was Ethan. If he failed, Bishop promised to take a chance and sort it out himself. Andre was clearly against it, but he couldn't say anything. Meanwhile, our hero had long since disappeared into the portal at his home. Suddenly, he came out from there, accompanied by Eliza. She agreed to help in exchange for sweets. As soon as they went outside, she complained about the terrible air. Ethan wondered if Eliza could destroy this monster. She smiled and asked who he took her for. Afterwards, she said that she could get into such a huge thing even with her eyes closed. Ethan pointed the camera at it and found out that this monster was level 300. Eliza said she would need a little help from him. Taking a step back, she explained that this world was too fragile for her power. Her words about the possible destruction of the city made the hero tense. He contacted Bishop and warned that a couple of buildings could be destroyed. He told him to only worry about catching the monster. After this, Ethan told Eliza that they could begin. She pulled the bow and asked if the hero was ready. He created a shield and said he was ready. The girl smiled and shot arrows. 2 powerful arrows shot towards the monster, causing a strong gust of wind. The hero was amazed by Eliza's strength. The arrows were rapidly approaching the monster. As they pierced his body, the monster screamed in pain. Bishop and the other hunters watched this in amazement. A moment later, the monster's body split in 2, began to fall. Once it was over, Ethan removed the shield. Afterwards, he looked around and asked if it was too much. She replied that this world was too weak. A smile appeared on Ethan's lips, and he thanked her for her help. She reminded him of their agreement and threw the meter back to him. The hero easily caught it and squeezed it in his palm. Eliza asked if this thing would be his proof. He nodded. Having completed her work, the girl turned around, heading back. Finally, she warned him not to trust other people. Ethan replied that she didn't have to worry about it. Now Bishop and Maria were heading to the place where the monster fell. Suddenly, the girl noticed a familiar figure ahead. Bishop immediately slowed down when he noticed Ethan. Then he got out of the car and called out to the guy. The other cars continued on their way, rushing past. Bishop immediately asked how the hero managed to deal with the monster. Ethan said it was a secret. Then Andre shouted out that someone else did it. That was the whole secret. As proof, the hero threw the counter to the man. Andre was shocked by the number, because even Bishop only had 170. Seeing his bewilderment, Maria said that she personally gave it to Ethan. Andre frowned, realizing that it was impossible to fake the result. He stepped forward and said that he should have shown it later to get the reward, not now. At this moment, the hero reminded that the head of the guild had promised him something. Therefore, since he caught the monster, he will take care of his own reward. Andre started shouting again, dissatisfied with his words. But Bishop stopped him with a wave of his hand. Afterwards, he shouted to him that the authority of their guild was more important than any money. Hearing this, Andre apologized for his lack of restraint. Afterwards, Bishop brought his changes to Ethan and said that the entire amount would be paid to him. He also promised to transfer all rights to the monster's corpse to him. The hero nodded, thinking that this man could be trusted. Andre gave them a displeased look, trying to understand Bishop's actions. He had doubts about whether the Titan Guild needed such a leader. Taking out his phone, he began to search for the right number. Rumors of what happened reached other guilds. The Aten Guild scout was informed that Call had been hospitalized. After learning the details, he asked to find out more about Ethan. Afterwards, he told his colleague that this guy is a hidden class. When he asked if Pol was sure about this, he replied that he was sure. Meanwhile, our hero slept peacefully. Waking up, he opened his eyes slightly. Then he rose up in bed, holding his head. When he looked at his phone, he found out that he had slept for 2 days. Having ordered food, he left the room and stopped. Eliza looked at him, munching on cookies. Ethan looked around and was horrified by what was going on here. It took him a couple of minutes to clear away all the trash. Afterwards, he asked how Eliza was able to eat all of this in just 2 days. When she said she had no choice, he asked why she didn't come back. The girl replied that if she could, she would have left long ago. Seeing the confusion on Ethan's face, she said that he had not opened the portal for her. Ethan opened the door and behind it was a portal and said that he had always been here. There was obvious surprise on Eliza's face. She closed the door and pushed Ethan away. Then she touched the handle herself, opening it, but she saw nothing but an ordinary room. Eliza showed it to a surprised Ethan, saying there was nothing there. He threw up his hands and said that the entrance to the dungeon always opened when he was there. Eliza assumed that the mage had tied Ethan to the travel indicator. The hero didn't understand anything, and she said that the final goal of the dungeon was him. Ethan asked if it was possible for the dungeon to fall right on top of him. When Eliza answered yes, he realized how lucky he was. Suddenly, his stomach growled, reminding him of its presence. A few minutes later, the courier arrived and delivered the order. Afterwards, he showed the bag of food to Eliza, saying that now they could eat. While Ethan was unpacking the package, she asked how the courier found the house with stealth magic cast on it. The hero looked at her with incomprehension. Eliza said that strange people from the Aten Guild came here and she cast magic. Ethan reached for his phone, wondering what had happened while he was sleeping. Eliza immediately began to eat. The hero looked at the latest news with displeasure. Noticing this, the girl asked him if he had any problems. He answered uncertainly that his fame was now much higher than before. The girl just sighed and continued eating. When he went out onto the balcony, he saw people in suits near the house. The hero really didn't like this extra attention to his person. He knew that as soon as a competitor appeared in the guilds, a dangerous race with him began. Ethan sighed and decided that he needed to do something else right now. Afterwards, he told Eliza to get ready. They were going back. The hero decided to focus on building up his strength. Armed with a bat, he and the girl walked through the portal. All this time, another person was watching Ethan's house. Meanwhile, our heroes arrived to Austin. They dragged the head of the slain monster to him. When the dwarf asked where the rest of the body was, Ethan replied that it had rotted and was no longer usable. As soon as Eliza admitted that it was because of her arrows, an argument broke out between them. Ethan decided to intervene and asked if Austin could make something out of the head. He asked for a little time and approached the body. Then he touched the monster's palm, and immediately flashes of lightning passed through it. Ethan and Eliza looked at each other, not understanding what he was doing. Suddenly, Austin pierced the monster's body with his hand. With a sharp movement, he pulled out a blue sphere from there. When Ethan asked what it was, he explained that it was the monster that shot lightning with it. Then he added that if you put an enchantment on the bat, Ethan would be able to do the same. The hero immediately perked up and asked the gnome to add this feature. Afterwards, he approached Eliza and conveyed the gnome's request that she take a walk somewhere during this time. The girl couldn't hold back and took out her bow, shouting threats. Sometime later, the hero went to the store for sweets. Feeling something, he immediately stopped. After mastering the aura, his senses became heightened, so Ethan became wary. He felt like someone was watching him from the shadows now. He put his bags on the ground. Taking out a bat, he shouted for the stranger to show himself. But no one ever came out. Suddenly, Ethan felt someone approaching him imperceptibly. The next moment, the stranger revealed himself. Running out of the tunnel, he took out his sword and rushed at the hero. Ethan was able to block his first punch. He asked the stranger who he was and why he attacked. He didn't intend to answer. Realizing this, Ethan pushed the man away from him. Then he jumped on him from above, saying that in that case he would knock out the answers himself. But he became transparent again, realizing that he could not win in a close fight. A moment later, the bat hit the ground. The hero looked around, trying to spot the enemy. Suddenly, he felt his presence to his right. He moved the bat in time and blocked the sword strike again. He tried to swing it to attack, but the enemy disappeared again. Ethan didn't like this situation very much. If he had his bat, he would have easily gotten rid of his opponent. So he decided to hide, realizing that the invisible enemy was too dangerous. At that moment, the stranger materialized back. Having attached a beacon to Ethan, he rushed after him. The hero managed to quickly disappear through the crowds on the noisy streets. But for Thomas, this was not a problem. Thanks to the beacon, he quickly calculated its location. He was sure that now Ethan would not be able to escape from him. Entering the building, he took the elevator up to the 8th floor. Thomas went out and looked around the floor carefully. On the movie theater floor, there wasn't much room for Ethan to run to. He checked the signal again. Afterwards, he headed towards the toilets. At the same time, the man took out a knife and used his camouflage skill. Entering inside, he stopped at one of the booths. One kick was enough to knock down the door. He rushed forward, holding his hand with a knife in front of him. However, what he saw the next moment surprised him. There was no one inside, and his chip was hanging on the wall. At the same moment, Ethan jumped out from around the corner with his bat raised. He struck, but Thomas managed to step aside. Then he struck back with a knife, which Ethan dodged as well. He grabbed the man by the wrist, and a moment later he threw him to the floor. He groaned in pain as he found himself on the hard floor. Ethan swung the bat and asked Tom why he was trying to kill him. Meanwhile, a father and son approached the toilet door with a sign saying "Work in Progress." Despite the ban, the man let his son inside. He himself remained behind the door, making sure that no one entered. Once inside, the boy froze in shock. He witnessed our hero's battles with Thomas. Ethan sighed and told the boy that it was dangerous here and he had better leave. Thomas decided to take advantage of the opportunity while the hero was distracted. Creating a flame in his palm, he threw Ethan away. He swore quietly and gripped the bat tighter in his hand. The next moment, his eyes widened in surprise. Thomas fired straight at the boy. Ethan put up a shield in time, holding the child close to him. Reacting to the noise, the boy's father entered. Cinemagoers immediately rushed towards the exit after noticing the strange smoke. Thomas, amazed by Ethan's strength, also mingled among them. Even though his mission failed this time, he will definitely return and finish the job. Suddenly, Thomas stopped. He felt something pierce his body. Ethan threw the bat at his back, killing his opponent. Only later did he realize that he had miscalculated his strength and had killed a man for the first time. The hero sighed heavily and lowered his head, holding his knees with his hands. Suddenly, the system reported that the hidden condition for receiving the second class had been met. The police arrived soon after. Ethan sat on the bench, wondering why he had a second class. He knew that when a hunter kills, he becomes a villain and the cleric becomes unavailable. Suddenly, two men approached him. They showed their officer's credentials and asked Ethan for his cooperation. Ethan told everything that happened here. Afterwards, he asked if everything was okay with that child. Tim replied that yes. His partner conveyed gratitude on behalf of the boy's father. Tim also said that if it weren't for Ethan, things could have ended badly. He also said that this would be recognized as self-defense and there would be no problems. Ethan was surprised that everything was resolved so simply. Tim looked at him and asked if Ethan had earned the title of villain. He shook his head and then the man explained that this happens after a deliberate murder. That is why what happened here will be considered self-defense. Tip also asked that Ethan not tell anyone about this. Receiving his nod, the man reached into his inside pocket. Taking something out of there, he said that this would be their precaution. After handing the device to the hero, Tim asked him to always carry it with him. Ethan looked at it carefully when he was told how to use it. Having finished with everything, the man rose from his seat. The hero said goodbye to the police and headed away. The men were discussing this guy among themselves. They also heard rumors about Ethan and his abilities. Tim was sure that there was something wrong with this guy, so he decided to be on his guard. Returning home, the hero studied his new class, Judge. He immediately decided to test his skills in practice. Descending into the dungeon, he immediately ran into a goblin. Thanks to the skill Hard Skin, he easily withstood his attack. His ability also neutralized the poison. Clenching his hand into a fist, he swung to strike. Then he attacked the monster with it. He couldn't use aura, but instead he gained the fighting spirit skill. Ethan jumped from his seat towards the remaining goblins. Thanks to the defense charge, he could attack with the strength of a tank. After killing all the goblins, Ethan looked at his hands with a smile. Having called up the system window, he looked through all the skills and tried them out. Seeing that there was still one left, he turned on the camera. Then he pointed it at himself and saw the number 64 above his head. He realized that numbers are a person's karma. After analyzing everything, he realized that he became stronger when he fought bad guys. This skill directly pushed the hero to hunt villains. A little later, he visited Austin's house. His bat was already ready. Austin explained to Ethan what exactly he had improved in his batting. The hero was sincerely amazed by the dwarf's skill. Afterwards, he asked how exactly he should use the new skill. The gnome replied that there was one monster in the yard on which he could try everything out. Upon seeing them, the monster immediately growled. When Ethan asked if he needed to cast spells, the dwarf shook his head. Ethan thought about it as Austin explained everything to him. He needed to imagine the electricity shooting off his bat. He sighed and closed his eyes, imagining. As soon as he felt something, he opened his eyes. The next moment, he threw a ball of lightning at the monster. He howled in pain when the ball hit him. His entire body instantly turned to coals, after which his remains fell to the ground. Austin smiled contentedly as he watched this. Ethan was also pleased with the result. Eliza ripped the badge from his neck and asked what he was doing outside. When she said that she no longer honored his divine power, the hero was surprised. She also asked what this suspicious device was. The hero sighed and explained to her everything that had happened. Austin also listened about how something changed Ethan's power to something else. Frowning, he said he would try to figure out the device. Hearing this, the hero was very surprised. But as usual, Austin first gave him a task as payment. The gnome reached into his bag, saying that the task would not be difficult. Afterwards, he threw the found thing to Ethan. He looked at the compass in bewilderment. Eliza asked Austin hesitantly if it was worth sending him there. When he replied that it was no big deal, Ethan had a bad feeling. Sometime later, our hero reached the indicated place. Holding onto the rope, he carefully descended down the cliff. He did not understand why the ore had to be mined here. Suddenly, Eliza pulled the rope and said that he was too slow. Ethan yelled at her to leave the rope alone. She sighed and told him to follow her. The next moment, she was no longer in her former place. She jumped, doing a somersault in the air. The enchanted hero watched her closely. Meanwhile, she had already deftly landed on one of the rock ledges. Ethan sighed and said that he couldn't either. She replied that he was afraid of everything. The hero thought about her words. Suddenly, the girl jumped and flew down. Ethan decided that he couldn't delay either. So following Eliza's example, he let go of the rope. A moment later, he was already flying down. Eliza watched with a smile on her lips as Ethan landed next to her. Afterwards, she praised him for his courage. Deciding to take a short break, they discussed what had happened to him again. After learning about karma, Eliza understood the meaning of Ethan's strange looks. When she asked what her value was, he replied 82. She sighed and said that there was nothing surprising about this. Her life had been difficult. The hero admitted that the difference between them was only 20 points. Rising from her seat, she said that in her world there were saints who could distinguish good from evil. Ethan looked at her in bewilderment and said that he was far from holy. She changed the subject, saying that first they had to figure out his abilities. When he asked her why she was so interested, she admitted that she was interested in Ethan. Afterwards, she suggested getting out of here to learn more about karma. The hero smiled, mentally asking Austin for forgiveness. Saying that she was right, Ethan took out the hearthstone. The next moment, he crushed it, activating it. A blue portal immediately appeared near them. There was obvious surprise on Eliza's face. As soon as the portal slammed shut, our heroes were no longer there. They were transported back to the human world. The girl used camouflage magic to avoid standing out too much. But even so, they attracted too much attention. Eliza smiled and said that her inner beauty could not be hidden. The hero just cleared his throat and sheepishly continued to sip his drink. The girl decided to sum up what they had managed to find out. Ethan said that karma increases if you do something bad, like break a promise. If the level of karma is more than 200, then there will be no punishment for killing such a person. Ethan assumed that in such cases, everything counted as self-defense. Eliza said it would be quite difficult for them to find someone with such a high number. Among ordinary people, Ethan did not see a number exceeding 50. Suddenly, he had an idea and said that they were going somewhere else. A few hours later, they were already on a street full of bars and clubs. Eliza looked around with interest. Suddenly, a stranger blocked their path, taking an interest in the girl. He said that there was a special offer at the bar and beautiful ladies would get free cocktails. Eliza declined his offer and moved on. But Ethan grabbed her shoulder, stopping her. He said that since it was free, it would be a sin not to take advantage of the chance. Eliza sighed and followed the man. A joyful smile played across Ethan's face as he found his first target. This man's karma number was 300. Sometime later, the two of them were sitting at the bar, drinking their drinks. When they passed out, Jacob smiled. Then he waved, giving a signal to the men sitting in the corner. They immediately approached our heroes, voicing their plans. At that moment, Ethan opened his eyes. He swung his hand and hit one of the men in the face. The paralyzing poison in the hero's body was neutralized almost immediately, so he easily sent the man flying. Without wasting time, the hero switched to the next opponent. Eliza still sat with her eyes closed. Only when she heard the noise and the sound of breaking furniture did she wake up. Afterwards, she said that she accidentally dozed off. She looked back and asked Ethan who these guys were. He smiled and replied that they were bad guys. Standing to the side, Jacob asked the remaining man to do something. He, flexing his fists, promised that he would sort everything out. Afterwards, he rushed towards our hero. Ethan frowned at the sight of him. When Eliza offered her help, he refused. At that moment, the man attacked, but the hero easily held back his blow with his fist, not allowing him to move. Then he carefully asked if Ethan was a hunter. The hero replied that the man also looked like him, but for some reason he was playing a bandit. Realizing the full horror of the situation, the bandit decided that he needed to escape. Ethan suddenly squeezed his hand harder and the man cried out in pain. The next moment, the hero's fist flew into his face. He immediately flew back, knocking over chairs. Having dealt with him, Ethan rushed at Jacob. Before he could escape, he was grabbed by the neck in a death grip. Smiling, Ethan said he had a lot of questions for him. When the bartender asked him to put it down, the hero raised his fist to punch. The next moment, a scream was heard and drops of blood flew across the wall. After beating him badly enough, Ethan let the man go. He sat down in the chair opposite and began asking questions. When he began to deny everything, the hero's face became more serious. He asked how Jacob managed to hire these thugs, and who helped him with this, because it is impossible to arrange all this on his own. Ethan warned that this was Jacob's last chance to tell everything. He wiped away the blood and said that no one helped him. The hero tried to understand why this man so vehemently denied everything. Deciding to take extreme measures, he grabbed Jacob by the leg and pulled him towards himself. He asked fearfully what Ethan was doing. The hero replied that he would help him speak a little. Jacob shouted that he would never tell him anything. At that moment, Eliza came up to him and asked him to step aside. The next moment, a pink glow appeared on her palm. She held her pink-covered fingers out to Jacob. The sweet aroma instantly filled his nostrils. Suddenly his head dropped and his shoulders began to shake with laughter. He spoke all sorts of incoherent nonsense, mentioning Atan many times. Ethan asked what Eliza did to him. She said that she made him a little more accommodating. Meanwhile, the man continued talking about Titan and Aten. From Jacob's chatter, Ethan realized that Titan was behind everything. When he asked why Titan would emerge victorious, he said it was all because of the Aura elixir. The hero frowned and asked what it was. A little later, the police arrived at the scene. After what Ethan learned, he realized that things were getting serious. At the end, Jacob, whose body is now being examined by doctors, explained what kind of potion it was. Eliza admitted that there is something similar in their world, only it was called the Queen's Tear. One of her friends was sacrificed to create this elixir. So Eliza, driven by a thirst for revenge, became stronger and got rid of everyone who participated in this. When the girl remembered this, she was filled with anger. Ethan now understood the reason for her depression. Nodding, Eliza asked what they would do next. He smiled and replied that they must destroy everyone before the elixir was ready. An hour later, a mysterious figure appeared in the deserted bar. After contacting his superiors, he reported that John was dead. He found it strange that the killers left immediately after the murder. He ran his finger through the dried blood as he listened to the order. When he was told to find the killer, he replied that he would do everything in the best possible way.